Dobry wieczór. Witam wszystkich bardzo serdecznie. Mam na imię Miriam
So, good evening,
Klimova
everyone. My name is Miriam
w Izraelu, w
Klimova. I am a
Haifa.
rabbi in Israel, in
I dzisiaj
Haifa.
kontynuujemy nasze spotkania i dzisiaj mówimy o następnym temacie.
So,
I myślę, że właśnie ten
we'll
temat
be
z jednej strony jest
continuing
bardzo
our
ciężki i bardzo
lessons.
unikający.
So, I think that on the one
A
hand,
z
this
drugiej
is a
strony
very
uważam,
difficult
że
topic. Everyone
warto
is
go
trying to
zrozumieć,
avoid
bo
it.
wierzę, że znasz
But
albo
on the other
znacie
hand,
całe
I think
tradycje
that
żydowskie.
if you
Więc
understand it,
dzisiaj mówimy
then you
o
will understand and know
symbolu
the whole Jewish
żydowskim.
tradition. So
Brzmi
today
to
we'll be
bardzo
talking
książkowo,
about
ale
codes
przypomnę
of
nam,
Jewish
skąd
law.
w ogóle
So it sounds
trafiliśmy do tego
difficult,
tematu.
but let me remind you
Więc
how we got
mówiliśmy,
to this
że
topic.
najbardziej ważnym źródłem tradycji żydowskiej
So we
jest
said that
Tanach,
the most
czyli
important
pierwsze
source
miejsce,
of the Jewish
tutaj mamy
tradition is the
głosowanie.
Tanakh.
Tutaj mój
So if
Tanach
there was a
pierwszy.
vote, the
Jutro
Torah, the five
rozpoczynamy
books of
przeglądanie
Moses, would be in the
historii
first
Bogiem
place.
Świętego,
It
jak
describes
Mojżesz
all the
przeżył
events from the
Księgę
creation of the
Wybór.
world up
Dalej
until the
musimy
death of
przyjść do
Moses.
ziemi wybranej. I kiedy tam przychodzimy, to
Then
ta ziemia nie
we
czeka nas za
have to
bramą.
reach
Nie mówi
the
nam, proszę bardzo,
land of
wejdźcie
Israel,
do
but
tego
when we
miejsca,
get
jakie
there, it
chcecie.
doesn't wait for
Ale
us with
ziemią,
bread. It doesn't
którą
tell us,
się
well,
my
just choose
wyznaczyć,
whatever
możemy
place you
zdobyć.
want. We have
Więc
to
tym się
conquer
zajmuje
this land.
Jehoszua ben
We
Nun,
have to win it
człowiek,
over.
który był
So
następcą
Yehoshua ben
Mojżesza.
Nun
I
is
właśnie od tej książki,
doing
księgi
that. He
Wybór,
was the
zaczyna
successor
się
of
rozdział
Moses,
Neviim,
and
rozdział
the
proroków.
Nevi'im
W
section of
tym
the prophets
rozdziale
starts with the
spotykamy
book of
historię
Joshua.
żydowską,
In
która
this
opisuje nam różne wydarzenia.
section, we
Od
read about the Jewish
okresu
history, which describes various events from the era of the
początków
judges, Shoftim,
Malachim.
through the
Też
kings,
w
Malachim.
tym Tanach Biblii hebrajskiej mamy Ktuvim,
So
dwa
in the
rozdziały,
Tanakh,
które
the Hebrew
opisują
Bible, we
różne
also have
sytuacje
the Ktuvim,
charakterystyczne Księgi
which
Mojżeszowej,
contains many interesting books.
Księgi
The
Psalmów,
books of wisdom,
Divrei
the
Hayamim,
Psalms,
księgi,
Divrei
które badają
Hayamim,
nam naszą
the
historię.
books which
I to
remind
wszystko, co
us
mamy w
about
Biblii
our
hebrajskiej.
history. And this is
Też nazywane
the
jest
canon of
Biblię
Hebrew
w naszej
literature.
tradycji Kaf Dalet
We
Sfarim,
call it
czyli
Kaf Dalet
24 księgi,
Sfarim, so the
które
24
liczą
books.
się w Biblii hebrajskiej.
These are books which
Czyli
are
to jest
part of
podstawa
the Hebrew
życiowa.
Bible.
Ale
So
co
we know
znaczy
that this
podstawa?
is the foundation.
Potem też
But what
wspomnieliśmy,
happens
powiedzieliśmy, że
next?
tradycja
We also
żydowska
talked about
mówi
this.
nam o
We
tym, że
said
jest
that
Tora
Jewish
Shebichtav,
tradition
jest
teaches us that
Księga
we have Torah
zapisanych,
Shebichtav,
ale jest
the
też
written
Tora
Torah,
ustna.
but we
Tora
also have the oral
Shebe'al-Peh.
Torah, Torah
Be'al-Peh po
Shebe'al
hebrajsku to też oznacza
Be'al in Hebrew
powtarzać, uczyć się
means,
czegoś na
among
pamięć.
others,
Czyli
to
to też coś
learn
świadczy o
something
tym,
by
że
heart, to
owe
memorize
teksty,
it.
które dzisiaj widzimy jako teksty,
So
ale
this
wcześniej
tells us that today
intuicyjnie
we
były pisane.
look
A
at them
jak była
as
to
texts, but
tradycja,
before it was not
przekazywała
written
się
down.
ustno od
It was a
pokolenia do
tradition that
pokolenia,
was being
tworzywała się
passed
też
orally
ustnie.
from generation to
Kiedy mówimy
generation,
o tym,
and it was
czym
created
jest
orally.
tradycja ustna?
So when we talk
Jest to
about
tradycja
the oral tradition, when we
poszukiwania
try to define it,
Tory pisanej.
it was a
Bo Tora
tradition of
pisana odpowiada z jednej
commenting on
strony,
the written Torah,
powiedzmy, swojemu
because the
czasowi,
written Torah, on the one hand,
pokoleniu.
corresponds to
Coś
its
nowego.
own time.
I
In
każde
each
przykazanie
generation, there
może
is
nam
something
odpowiedzieć
new.
na takie
So,
pytanie, na
not every
przykład
commandment can answer
jeżeli
all of our
pójdę
questions.
do
For
synagogi w
example,
szabat,
if
czy
I go
mogę
to a
na przykład
synagogue on Shabbat,
wykorzystać
can
parasol?
I, for example,
I
use
wtedy
an umbrella?
halacha, czyli prawo ustne,
And then
musi nam
the
znaleźć
halacha,
jakieś
the
odpowiedzi
oral
i
law,
powiedzieć nam,
has
że nie
to
możemy
find
udzielić mu tej odpowiedzi,
uh,
ponieważ
a
nie
way
mamy
to answer our
w
question,
czasach
because
Tory, ponieważ
they did not
komputer nie
have
istniał,
umbrellas
telefon
in
nie
the
istniał,
times of Torah. There were
nawet
no computers,
nie
no
było prądu,
internet,
nawet prądu nie było
there
w
was
domach.
no
Więc
electricity in
tradycja
those times.
musi z czasem
So the
jakoś to
tradition with
adaptować i
time
znaleźć
has to
odpowiedzi na
adapt.
pytania.
It
I
has
dlatego
to find
prawo
answers to
żydowskie
such
nazywa się
questions.
halachą. Halacha od
That's
słowa
why this
iść,
is called the
lalehet.
halacha, from the
Dosłownie.
word lalehet,
I
to
myślę,
go,
że
to
w ogóle
walk. This
cała
is a
tradycja
verb.
żydowska nie
And I
jest
think that the
rzeczownikiem,
whole
lecz
Jewish
czasownikiem,
tradition is not a
ponieważ cały
noun,
czas
but it's a verb.
musi się
And that's
adaptować,
because it
czyli
has to
musi iść
adapt
dalej.
all of the times.
Kiedy mówimy
it has to continue on evolving. So when we talk about the halacha and about the oral law, then just to remind ourselves, we talked about various sages and generations of sages that we called Chazal. So the Chazal, Chachamenu Zichram Livraha, the sages of blessed memory, we have several generations, starting from the times before the destruction of the temple, through the times of the destruction and after the destruction of the temple. So we have the generations of the pair of Tzugot, of Tanaim, those active in the temple times, Amoraim, Savoraim. One of the most important stages was the compilation of the Mishnah, the editing. I don't even mean writing it down, because the Mishnah was edited orally by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. And then Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was editing, compiling the Mishnah. What does it mean? It means that there were many different laws, many different issues, many topics, and also many ideas, concepts, many answers. So you had many different answers to every question. And then Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, on his own, he selected the answers that, well, now in the 21st century, we can say that simply he preferred. So when he selected those answers, he compiled them into one volume and he said, okay, this collection is the Mishnah. This is the oral law. And all the other parts of this tradition continued to exist. Part of them were also compiled into a different collection called the Tosefta, and partially they would just exist. So when the next generations had to describe the Mishnah somehow, and why did you have to comment on the Mishnah? It's because it was a very concise work, very brief, very difficult to understand. That's why you needed comments on it. You needed to give some examples. So it's always some stories, sometimes miraculous stories. You had demons and angels in them, and this is what the next generation of Amoraim does. This is the generation that is commenting on the Mishnah and compiles the Talmud. So then we have the Talmuds, actually two, the Jerusalem and the Babylonian one. So the next generation of Savoraim, they were just completing the redaction. So the Mishnah was being compiled by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, and the final edition took place at the beginning of the third of century, and then other generations started to comment on the Mishnah, what the Mishnah was focusing on, and what kind of examples you can add to that. We have the Jerusalem Talmud, which was developing in the north of Israel, geographically speaking, and we have the Babylonian Talmud that was developing in the educational centers in Babylonia, and we had two main centers, Pumbedita and Sura. And there you had the largest yeshivot, and they were commenting on what and how should be done. Then we have the next era, the Geonim. So they were the leaders, the heads, the directors of the yeshivot. And one of their greatest contribution was to write Shelot ut Shuvot. So if people had some questions, Shelot, they would write the questions to them, and they were so influential that they would write halachic responsa, so legal answers on what should be done in specific situations. So this were the geonim Sura Pumpedita. We know where that was. And the next era that we'll be discussing today, and we've already started last time, is the era of the Rishonim. Rishonim, translated from Hebrew, means first, the first scholars. So in Jewish history, Jewish tradition, these are scholars in the late medieval period after the Geonim and before the Shulchan Aruch was written. So today we'll be asking, what is the Shulchan Aruch? So in terms of centuries, it's between the 11th and the 16th century. Aharonim, the generation that came after, are the late ones, and Rishonim are the early.
Co ważne jest powiedzieć, kiedy mówimy też o dzieleniu tych epok i mówimy tak
So as we are
konkretnie
dividing different eras, we say it's between 11th and 16th century, we do not have one specific date. If we studied history, and we all did, then we know that each era, every name is something that was imposed later. These names came from the future. No era knew how it would be called. And the same applies here. Rishonim didn't know that we would call them Rishonim. So these names were added later, and also the division into specific eras, specific periods. It's also something that's not very specific. Usually, it's believed that the end of the Gonim period was the death of Rabbi Hai Gaon in 1038, and then for 2 more years you had the yeshiva in Pumpedita, but this is more or less the end of this period, and it's the also closing of the yeshiva in Sura. So how about the transition into a new era? Something had to change for us to say, okay, it's a new era now. So what's changed is that Sura and Pumbedita, the centers of Jewish studies, were no longer central centers. Now Jews would start to settle in different states, countries. So last time we said that they would move, for example, to Spain, but also in the same time, the 10th, 11th century, they would move to other places in Europe. So one of the largest centers of Jewish knowledge was in Spain. We talked about the golden age of the Iberian Jews. And that's when one of the most prominent rabbis of this time lived. We call him Rif. This is an abbreviation from Rabbi Yitzhak ben Yaakov Alfasi. And when we say Alfasi, then this already tells us where he lived. But today I was checking various Polish names, and I saw that Wikipedia in Polish is saying something that's not true. It says that it's called Alfasi because of the town Fez, which is true, but where is Fez? That's in Morocco. That's right. So some sources tell us that he was born in Morocco, but that is not true. And another example, Maharal Prague. Maharal from Prague. Do you know where he was born? Not in Prague, in Poznań. But no one is calling him the Maharal from Poznań. Why? He was born in Poznań, but he rose to prominence when he was working and staying in Prague. That's why he's called Maharal in Prague, not from Poznań or Posen or whatever you want to call it. And the same goes for Rif, Rabbi Yitzhak ben Yaakov Alfasi. Alfasi stems from the town of Fez, but he was actually born in Algeria. Then he studied and he moved to Morocco, to Fez. That's how he's called. But due to the persecution of Jews, he had to move to Morocco, where he served as a rabbi. But in 1088, he was forced to flee from there as well. That was the fate in those times, that they were simply followed by the prosecutions. So after he fled another time, he moved to Spain, to Cordoba. So we know this area very well already. So why are we talking about him? We are talking about Rif, Rabbi Yitzhak Alfasi, because he was the one who presented the Talmud for the first time as something giving definite halachic solutions. So in his works, he would quote sources from the Talmud. He's quoting the Talmud, but he adds his own commentary. Sefer HaHalachot, that is his work, so the book of laws. And there he shows us some specific decisions made on a given topic. He doesn't create a code, but he's writing decisions, settlements on given topics. So this is the first attempt to codify Jewish law. Not just a situation when we have the Talmud, we have to look through it and we see that you have several different opinions. The next attempt that we've already discussed was Rambam. So Rambam, as a philosopher, a theologist, Talmudist, a rabbi, a doctor, he was active in many different areas, and he was the first one who codified the law. And he divided it into 14 sections. That's why his work is called Yad HaHazakah. So Yad, on the one hand, means hand in Hebrew. On the other one, Yud and Dalet in Gematria. It gives us Yud 10, Dalet 4, so 14 books, 14 chapters, or 14 volumes. And he called his work Mishneh Torah. So it was a code of Jewish law. It didn't give any sources, but he simply selected some laws, but that was a great effort. He simply ordered all the questions related to the Jewish tradition according to specific topics, to specific chapters. We also have his explanation. So the goal of this work is to make the laws of the Torah accessible to everyone, both to the small and to the great. All the commandments, to make sure everything is well explained. And that's why he calls it Mishneh Torah, the repetition of the Torah. because
człowiek, który ma Mishneh Torah w ręku,
he believed
musi
that
nie nawet
someone who has access to
oglądać
his Mishneh
tego
Torah
dzieła, ale
doesn't
ta Tora
even need to
zapisana.
read the Talmud. The
Uporządkowana
whole oral
w jednym
Torah has
miejscu.
been ordered and
Dlaczego to robi?
put
Ponieważ
in
ci
one
ludzie w
place.
tamtych czasach
Why is he doing that?
spadły na
Because he
nich
says that in our
ciężkie
times
trudności,
new
przygody,
tragedies have befallen us, and the
wszystko
difficulties, the
zemdlałość,
atrocities have led to a situation
małżeństwo
when
zniszczyło
our
się.
sages have lost their wisdom
Dlatego to
and understanding has
wywołuje
hidden
coś,
away
co
from
u
the
nas
scholars.
wydawało się
That's why what the Geonim
powiedziane,
believed to
jasne,
be
w
clear and
tamtych
well
czasach było
explained
trudno
in
przyjąć.
our times
Ciężko to
is
zrozumieć.
difficult.
I
It's
mówi,
hard to
trzeba
understand. So he
konkretny
says
kodeks.
we need to have a
Pójść powodzenia
comprehensive
na
code.
Talmudzie
The code would be
babilońskim.
based on the
Ja
Babylonian
jestem z
Talmud. He
Maimona
says,
z
I am
Hiszpanii.
the son of Maimon
Depende z
from
pomocą
Spain,
Boga.
and
I
I
właśnie sporządzam ten
rely on
kodeks
the help of God,
mej
and I am preparing this code
najświętszej
of law,
dzieł.
which stems from all those
Mamy
works.
pierwszy kodeks,
That's how we got
Mishneh
the
Torah.
first code, Mishneh
Wyspowiadał
Torah,
nam Ramba.
and it was
Ale
created by Rambam.
dzieło to z jednej strony jest napisane w języku hebrajskim.
This work, on the one hand, is
Zauważmy, że
written
inne
in
swoje dzieła pisał w
Hebrew.
języku
He wrote his other works in
arabo-hebrajskim.
an
Takim
Arabic
mieliśmy na
Hebrew,
przykład Idisz, który
like
był
we had Yiddish,
swego rodzaju
which was
germańskim
a
językiem
kind of a
żydowskim,
mix
a
between
jednak
German and
tak
Hebrew.
samo językiem żydowskim
So,
był
likewise,
wtedy
the
mówił Rambam w Hiszpanii
language
arabskiej,
used by
w
Jews in those times in Arabic Spain,
Mówił
in the
w swoim
Caliphate,
języku
was
judeo-arabskim
the
i później
Judeo-Arabic language, and that's the language he used
swoje
to
pismo
write his
Morany Wuchim.
other works, Moran Rebuchim.
Tłumaczymy Morany Wuchim, kto mi pomoże?
How do we translate
Przewodnik
that?
błądzących.
Dla
The
błądzących.
guide for the perplexed.
Przewodnik błądzących napisał w tym języku
So it was written
arabo-hebrajskim.
in this
Tutaj
Judeo-Arabic
miał
language.
zamiar napisać w języku hebrajskim i też powiedział,
And
że pisze
here
w prostym
he
hebrajskim,
decided to
w
write in
zwykłym
Hebrew, and
hebrajskim.
he said, I'm using very
I mówi,
simple
że
Hebrew.
nawet każdy Żyd, który
He
nie
said
posiada
that
umiejętności ani
every
motywacji, aby
Jew,
studiować
even if
Talmud,
they have no
wszystko zrozumie.
skills, no motivation to study the
Będzie
Talmud,
świadomy.
will be able to understand everything. Everything has
Brakuje w
been
tym jego
clearly explained. But what's
brakuje
missing from his code?
innych myśli, brakuje innych
You don't
odpowiedzi,
have
innych źródeł.
other
No i dlatego
ideas,
on mówi,
other
patrzcie,
answers, other
zobaczcie,
sources.
co
He
tu
simply
jest.
says that's how it
Okej,
should
a
be
ja nie
done,
chcę
but he
szukać
doesn't give you
gdzie,
where
co,
he got it
kiedy.
from.
No to
So if
zobaczmy
we
tam w
start to
Biblii,
look in the
na
Talmud to find his sources, we'll see that one rabbi, Yehuda or Lesh Lakish or someone said something like that. But Rambam chose one version and he codified it.
spojrzeli na kilka
So
innych
today,
wersji.
I'd like us to take a look at a couple of other codes to see how it
Zapisali 4
evolved.
osoby,
So we
o
have
których
4
dzisiaj mówimy.
characters
Już
that we'll
powiedzieliśmy,
be
Rambam miał
discussing
pierwszy
today.
kodeks.
So, as we
Więc
said,
to jedna
Rambam
osoba, która
created the
wpłynęła
first
na
code.
rozwijanie się
So, the
halachi
next person
żydowskiej,
who influenced the development of Jewish halacha, that was Rosh.
żebyśmy
That is an
Rosh,
abbreviation. We have many such. So,
B-I-R,
Rosh, which is
był to rabin niemiecko-hiszpański.
Rabbi
Powiedzieli, że Hiszpania i Niemcy
Yaakov
to jest daleko.
ben
Wytłumaczymy dzisiaj dlaczego.
Asher.
Był wybitnym talmudystą,
So he
autorem
was
wielu
an
książek.
distinguished
Znany on
Talmudist.
był
He
z
prepared
halachicznych
many
i
different
szczególnie był
works.
znany
He
ze
was a
swojego
recognized
skrócenia
halachic
Maimonides.
authority, and he's known from his
Maimonides
abbreviated
dlatego się zwraca do
version
niego
of
Maimonides.
Talmudic law,
On
so
to
something
napisał
resembling what
w swoim
Maimonides
pismie.
did, but there is a
Zamieścił
great
swoje tempo,
difference.
to
So
znaczy
he
komentował Talmud
had an abbreviated version of
zupełnie
the
w
law.
innym
It was more
kontekście.
of a comment of the
Nie,
Talmud,
zamieścił
but it was
w
not a
jego
code.
synu,
This will be done
Rabbi
by his
Yaakov ben
son,
Asher,
Rabbi
czyli
Yaakov ben
Asher ben
Asher.
Jehiel,
So Asher
syn
ben Yehiel
Jakob ben
and his
Asher,
son Yaakov
czyli
ben
Jakub,
Asher.
syn
So
Ashera.
Jacob, the son of Asher.
Jego syn będzie nam znany też jako Baal Haturim,
His son will
albo
also be known
brat
as
albo
Baal
ojciec
Haturim,
Balatów.
or simply as
Będzie
Hatur.
wywodzić się od jego
And this will all
najbardziej
stem
ważnego
from his
dzieła,
most
które
important
napisał i
work.
które będzie miało wpływ na pokolenia do przodu.
This
Co
work was very
więc
influential. It
było to w
influenced
ogóle
many subsequent
jaki to był,
generations.
gdzie się
So
urodził? Był
let's
trzecim synem
discuss this in
tego
detail.
Rabbiego Ashera.
He was the third son
Urodził
of
się
Rabbi
mnich.
Asher.
Był
He had
trzecim synem. Urodził się w
who had 8
1309
children. He was the third son. He was born
roku w Kolonii.
in the 13th
Wtedy na
century, around
terytorium
1217,
Cesarstwa
Cologne in
Rzymskiego.
Germany. Back then,
Zmarł
it
w
was
Tolido.
the
Coś nam mówi o bardzo długim
Holy
życiu
Roman
też
Empire.
i
Then
podróżach
he moved
życiowych.
to Toledo, so we already see that
Co
he
ważne,
traveled a
żeby
lot.
o nim znać, to to, że cały czas, jeżeli mówię, że musieli się przenieść z Cesarstwa
So when I
Rzymskiego
say that they had to move from the Holy
to
Roman
raczej
Empire
nie
to
było to
Spain, then
z
we must
jakiegoś
remember that it's not just because
przypadkowości.
they
Było
felt
to przez
like moving,
prześladowania.
it was due to
Tak w roku
persecutions.
1304 w wyniku prześladowań
So in
Żydów
1304, as a result of the persecution of Jews in those regions, Ashkenaz
udał się
he left
do Hiszpanii
Ashkenaz along
aby
with his father and his
złapać
family, and he moved
zwycięstwo.
to
Ale
Spain.
po prostu
This is
zobaczmy
a
to
contemporary map,
olbrzymie
but just so we
olbrzymiej
can
wagi, jaką to jest.
understand, we can feel how long
Do
that journey
Hiszpanii
was to move from Spain,
daleka droga,
from
żeby
Ashkenaz.
złapać
It's a
prosto
long
też
way, and it
w różnych
was
punktach
not simple
musiał się
because at
zatrzymywać.
different points he had to
Wtedy,
stop,
kiedy się
he
tam
had to make a
przebywało, to jego
stop.
ojciec, ten Asher,
So when they moved
zostaje
there,
sędzią w
Asher
Beit zostaje
became a
głównym
judge in Beit Din. He
orędownikiem
became the leader of the Jewish
Toledo,
community in
właśnie w
Toledo.
Toledo.
So that's where they
I
moved.
wtedy właśnie, kiedy ojciec umiera, to jego brat
So
jest
when his father
następcą Judy
died, his
na jego
brother
opiece.
Judah or
Ale
Judah is the successor of
dlaczego
his father.
tak dobrze wiemy o tej rodzinie? Też mówią nam, są różne legendy. Czasami się mówi nam,
And we have
że
many different legends about this
jego
family.
brat umarł
So some say
jako
that his
swoje
brother
Kiddush Hashem, tak to
died
nazywa śmierć
as a Kiddush
niezwykła,
Hashem.
przyjść na inną
So that
religię
was the death if they
jeżeli
didn't want
chodzi
to
o
convert to a
wiercie
different
o
religion. So
przyjść na
they
inną
would rather
religię.
die than
Więc
convert to a
bardzo
different
dużo
religion.
opowiadań o tym.
So there are many different
Ale
stories about
są
that.
też rozmowy o samym Jakowie Ben
But
Asherze.
some
Mówi się,
also
że
say that
chciał wyruszyć na
Yaakov ben
Izrael,
Asher
do
himself
Izrael.
wanted to
I
go
często
to
słyszymy
the
podobne
land of
historie
Israel.
o różnych
And we often
prześladowaniach.
hear similar stories
Mówi
about
się, że chciał
various Jewish
wyruszyć do Izrael,
sages. They
ale
say that they wanted to go to
zmarł
the
w
land of
drodze
Israel, but
idąc
they
i
died
nie mógł
along the
tam
way and
kroczyć, tak?
they couldn't
Więc właśnie
enter
nie
Eretz
było nadzieji,
Israel.
ale odczucie wielu nowych olim, nowych
So
emigrantów
many
do
new
Izraela
Olim, many
pokazywało
new immigrants to
bardzo
Israel
ogromny
had
nażyli
this sense of
obraz
fascination that so many generations
Izraeli tak
dreamt about this
właśnie
land.
jesteśmy.
So many
Więc w
generations wanted
historii
to get here,
przeczytamy
and here
właśnie
we are.
Jakowie Ben
And
Asher.
according to one story,
Widzimy
this was also the
jego
fate of
znaną
Rabbi
postacią,
Jacob.
autor Baal Haturim. Nazwaliśmy go
So
i
he
jest taki
is a well-known
translacja
figure. He's the author of
Haturim,
Baal
utworów.
HaTurim. In
Jest
Jerusalem, there is a
Rehov
tram
Haturim.
station,
Co
there
to
is a
jest Haturim?
street, Rehov
To jest właśnie
HaTurim.
ten ważny kodeks, z
So
którego
Arba
zaczynamy.
Turim is the important
Kodeks,
code.
który nazywa się Arba'a Turim.
So it's called
4
Arba'a
kolumny.
Turim, which
Kodeks
means 4
halachiczny,
columns.
który
It's a
pisze
halachic
rabin
code,
Jakub ben Asher.
and it was written by Rabbi Jacob
I
ben Asher.
właśnie co on robi? On z początku opracowuje
So what did he do exactly?
rozstrzygnięcia swojego ojca. Powiedzieliśmy, że
At
jego
first,
ojciec
he is
Asher
basing his work on the works of
pisał
his father. So
komentarz
his
do
father,
Talmudu.
Asher,
I
wrote a
pierwsze, co
commentary
on
to the
robi,
Talmud.
on robi komentarz i uporządkowuje wszystko, co
So
napisał
the
jego
first
ojciec.
thing he did was to write a
Asher oczywiście
commentary and to
wrote.
order everything that his father
Zapisuje
wrote.
też jego responsy.
He also
Pod pytania
writes
Jakuba
down his
i
responsa.
opisuje te
So
halachiczne odpowiedzi, które
the questions and the answers, so the halachic answers that his father provided. And he compiles this into a book called Sefer HaRemazim. So the book of insinuations or of allusions. So regarding the law, different decisions, and it was often added as an addition to publications of the Talmud called Kitzur Piskei Harosh, so abbreviated settlements of Rosh, so of his father. So he is continuing the work of his father, of Rabbi Asher ben Yehiel. And what's next? Based on all these sources, he writes Arba Turim, his work, his code, the 4 columns. So the 4 collections. And now I have a question. How many chapters did Maimonides have in his work? We talked about that. Not 4, but Yad Hazaka, Yud Dalet. So how many? 14. Thank you, Barbara. Exactly, 14. So Maimonides had 14, and here we have 4. How is that possible? Well, that's very simple. And that's because Yaakov ben Asher focused on laws that applied to contemporary times, whereas Maimonides also included laws related to the temple, even though he lived 10 centuries after the temple existed, but nonetheless he included them. Whereas Yaakov ben Asher said, well, I'll be writing about what we have today. So he says, because our exile has extended, has prolonged, our forces have weakened, our hearts has grown weary, our hands have lost their power, our thoughts are not clear, and we have many disputes, and we have many different opinions. You don't have even one law that would be given in just one version. You have always discrepancies. So he focuses on laws that apply to contemporary times, to his times. So since there is no temple, then he won't be including laws related to the temple. And unlike Rambam's method, who rarely points to any sources, here Arba Turim, the 4 columns, include Talmudic sources. And he also adds his justification why he chose such sources instead of some other ones. Because in Jewish tradition, we have many, many different answers to every question. So, what's the structure and content of the book? So, it's called Arba Turim, so the 4 columns. So, we have 4 tur. Tur is the singular column. So he has 4 chapters in which he is trying to set a structure to Jewish law applying in his time. So Orach Chaim, the way of life, so laws related to everyday life, when to say the blessings, when to say the Shema, what blessings you need to say with different meals, if I'm drinking milk or if I'm eating bread or something else. So he simply gives you instructions. You're eating this, you need to say this. Because if in those times someone had to look for the answer in the Talmud, it would take a long time. If they were to read Rambam, they wouldn't know the source. Whereas here, he says, you have to say such and such blessing because in the Talmud it's written in the chapter, let's say, Besahet Brahot, so tractate about Brahot, page 69b, for example. So we have a clear explanation. It also includes laws related to Shabbat, to the new moon, to Rosh Chodesh, to Hagim, to fasts. It's all described in Orach Chaim, so the way of life. The next tur, Yoredea, teaches knowledge. So these are all matters related to what is forbidden and what is allowed regarding ritual slaughter, kashrut, idolatry, meat and milk, ritual purity, studying Torah, respect for the sages, and so on. And the third one, Even Haezer, the stone of help, laws related to marriages, divorce, the Levirat laws. So, what's happening at home? What if you have a widow without children? Does she have to marry the husband? So we have one version in the Torah, but the sages said, no, let's not do that. Let's have the Chalitza ritual. So then the brother does not have to marry the widow. So the sages in the Talmud sometimes would go against the Torah. They would say, we live in different times. These are not biblical times, so the law needs to be changed. And legal codes continue with the changes. And the fourth tur, Choshen Mishpat. So Choshen, that was the breastplate that was worn by the high priest. So Choshen Mishpat, that's the name of the fourth tur. So the breastplate of the court. And here we have mainly civil law, civilian law, financial matters. So Jewish law in the exile, in the diaspora, would cover all the areas of life. They did not have any other court but their own. So when today in contemporary Israel we have courts, we have the Supreme Court, then you no longer have a need of something like Choshen Mishpat. Why? Because we have a system. We are paying our taxes, we have a system, we have the judges who are studying the law, who are settling all these matters. So if there is an existing state of Israel, that's when the questions start. Do we want to give the rabbis, who are not the judges, the authority to settle various issues? And should they be relying on sources from the Middle Ages? Or would we rather have a legal system that's fitted to the 21st century, so a contemporary legal system? And then in Israel, you have many questions that are arising, because I'm sure every one of us would say that the legal system is an important part of an independent state and of democracy. And each reform conservative Jew would answer like that, but not everyone who lives in Israel. So that was one of the topics or of the reasons why in 2023, there were many demonstrations in Israel. It was about the reform of the legal system, and they were against the proposed changes. They wanted to keep the Supreme Court. So we talked about Rabbi Asher ben here we talked, Asher ben Yehiel, we talked about his son, Yaakov ben Asher, who created Arba Turim. And the next figure lived a bit later, Rabbi Yosef Karo, a very well-known name. Rabbi Yosef Karo was born in Toledo, so that's in Spain. We already discussed the story of Spain. He was one of the most prominent halachic authorities. He was the author of a work that is well known all around the world, Shulchan Aruch.
O historii krótko przypominam, było źle.
So, a short history lesson.
Początkowo
So,
Józef,
it
złoty
was not
mąż
good.
Marii, później
It started
z
with the
jednej strony
golden age,
kalifaty
but
tracił
then
swoją
on the one hand, the
władzę,
caliphates would
pozycję,
lose their
kompetencje,
power. On the other
dochodziło
hand, the Christian forces were
do przewrotów
pushing out
kolejno.
the
W
caliphates. So,
1492
in
roku
1492,
Żydzi zostali
the
wypędzeni
Jews were expelled from
Geruszu
Spain.
z Farat.
Gerush,
Więc właśnie
Farat.
ten rabin, Rabbi Yosef Karo, był z potomków
So, Rabbi Joseph Karo
najstarszych
was one of
Hiszpanii.
the
Kiedy mówimy o
descendants or one of those who was
życiorysie,
expelled from Spain.
mam taką mapkę, to zrobiłam w swoim telefonie przez
And
Google
I
Maps.
prepared this
Powiem
map
Ci,
in
że
my
to
phone
nie jest
through
wcale
Google
tak
Maps
ostatecznie
because
prawidłowe
it,
historycznie, ale
it's
jednocześnie
not
myślałam sobie, że
historically
tak
appropriate,
daleko
but
człowiek
I wanted to
musiał
show
uciekać
you how
i
far
jakby
away someone had
musiał
to
wyjść
escape
na
in
swoje
those
pozycje.
times and
I dlaczego
how
chciałam
many things
bardzo
they
często
passed
o
along their
historii
way.
Izraelu i w innych
Because
krajach
very often
często
in today's Israel, but also in
słyszymy
other
osobę,
places,
słyszymy jej akcent,
when we see a foreigner,
i
we
bardzo
hear someone with a
inaczej
foreign
się
accent,
tak odnosi do tej osoby.
then we treat
Nasze
them
zachowania są
differently.
inne,
So our behavior is
wyobraźcie
different.
sobie, co przeżywali
So just
dzieci
imagine
z
what these
tamtych
sages
czasów.
had to go
I
through.
wyobraźcie sobie, dlaczego właśnie stwarzali te swoje dzieła.
So let's imagine
Spójrzcie,
why they
jaką
were creating their
mapą musiał
works.
przejść.
So
Jeżeli
just take a look at the
wchodzą
map
wymiar
on the
Hiszpanii,
way they had
urodzenie
to
rabina Efraima ben
go through. So
Josefa
he
i
was
jego żony
born in
Klimona,
Spain in the family of Rabbi Ephraim ben Yosef and his wife, whose name was
kiedy
Buena,
był jeszcze
which means
dzieckiem,
good.
jego rodzina musiała
When
uciekać
Joseph was
do
still a child, his family had
1492
to
roku
escape from Spain in 1492. First, they moved to Lisbon, to Portugal.
ale w
But
1492
in
roku,
1497, a couple of years later,
1499 rokiem
they had
i
to
80
move again. So they settled in Constantinople.
Konstantynopol. O, jestem. Czyli
Yeah, it's a
dzisiaj
hard name
Istanbul.
to pronounce. So in Constantinople, today is Istanbul.
Ale też jego ojciec umiera
But
i
again, his
został
father
propozycją w domu
died.
swojego wuja,
So
rabina
Joseph
Yitzhaka
was raised in
Karo.
the home of his uncle, Rabbi Yitzhak
Przebywał jakiś czas
Karo.
w Egipcie, wiemy z jego własnych świadectw,
He,
więc
according to his own accounts,
prawdopodobnie
he stayed in Egypt for a
kiedy
while. So
myślał
we see
jeszcze o tym swoim Egipcie,
Constantinople, then
a później
Egypt,
też mówi się o tym, że mieszkał w Salonikach, czyli
and then it's said
wtedy
that he lived in
znowu
Thessaloniki,
kłopoty
so today's
wewnętrzne.
Greece. So again,
Kiedy
historic
też
turmoil.
opowiada się, że mieszkał jakiś czas w Adrianopolu
He
i
spent some
wcześniej
time in the
został
Adrianople,
wiaryzonem
and there he
księdzem
married to his
ortodoksyjnym
first
i
wife,
rabbinem.
who was a
Zawsze
wife
myślałam,
of
że
a prominent rabbi.
tradycji żydowskich księżniczka, córka rabina,
So
jakoś
in a
lepiej
Jewish
brzmi.
tradition, it had to be a
Tak, i
princess or
oczywiście
the daughter of a rabbi.
była z rodziny najbardziej szanowanej w mieście.
So she came from the
Więc
most respected family in the
wraz z żoną
city.
i dziećmi
So then, along with his wife
mieszkali w
and his
Salonikach.
children, they lived in
Wiemy o tym
Thessaloniki.
dokładnie, ponieważ nagrobki
And
się
we
tam
know about
znaleźli i
that
później
because we have the
wrócili dalej
tombstones
i ostatecznie
that were
przejechali do
preserved.
ziemi
Then they
Izraela.
continued their journey and finally they
Znamy
moved
Safed,
into the land of Israel
miasto
to Safed
Babylonii,
or Tzfat.
które jest
It's a
znane
city in the in the
przez
north of Israel, and
fascynacyjne
it's well known
obrazy
because
Madonny.
back in the days it
Powiem Ci
became a
też
cultural
jeszcze o
center.
ojcu Rabbi Josefa Karo, o tym, że kiedy już
So as
miał
for Joseph
88
Caro, when he
lat,
was about
to wtedy
80 years
właśnie
old,
jedna żona jego zmarła, druga zmarła, no
his first wife died, his second wife died. So when he was about 80, he married for the third time. So on the one hand, the Jewish tradition requires to keep on living, but on the other hand, he was quite an interesting person. I have not met many people who've married again at the age of 80, but he did. And Joseph Caro died in the town of Safed in 1575.
I ważne jest powiedzieć, że właśnie ten czas, kiedy
And,
tworzył
and it's
Józef
important to
Caro,
note that the
jest bardzo
time when Joseph Caro was
ważna
active
dla epoki.
is important because that's when a new era, a new period in Jewish tradition started, because it's said that his life started the era of Aharonim. Aharonim are the late ones.
Chyba nie muszę tak za dużo mówić, ponieważ już
I
powiedzieliśmy,
don't have to give you too much of a historical background. We already discussed that. So, in those times, the Jews were expelled from Spain. They were wandering around the world. The situation in Europe is not too good. You have many changes. I'm not talking about the Crusaders, but you have a pandemic, the Black Death in Europe in the 14th century. So, in general, the situation is not too good. And because of that, many Jewish sages would come to Safed. So, if someone lived in Thessaloniki and at the same time, the same empire that Thessaloniki was part of, or someone lived in Turkey and the same empire would conquer the land of Israel, then it was something like today's European Schengen. Because, okay, this empire has conquered Israel, so now we can move there. And that's how Joseph Caro ends up in Safed, in Sfat, along with others like Alkabetz, his friend, the author of Lecha Dodi, Shlomo Alkabetz. So, in the same time, with his friends, they arrived to Safed and they write letters to Thessaloniki and they say, "Boys, we are going there. We heard the voice of the Almighty that we have to go there." Well, someone has to pay for it. So some Jews are not ready to move, but they are financing the travel of others. So in the same time, they are meeting in Safed in the north of Israel, Sephardi Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, and this is a wonderful time for development. So Rabbi Joseph Caro decided to write a commentary to the work that we already discussed, to the work of Yaakov ben Asher, who was relying on the work of his father and who wrote the Arba Turim, the four columns. So he writes a commentary to it. So the four columns already included sources, contrary to Maimonides' work, and Joseph Caro writes a more extensive commentary and he calls it Beit Yosef, so the house of Joseph. And when he writes this commentary, then, it was very extensive, many quotes, many references to the Talmud, to many other sources, like, well, this is what Rabbi Yaakov said, and that's what his father Rosh said, and that's what Maimonides says. So a very comprehensive work. And then he decided to write the abbreviated version of it. Why would he have to write this abbreviated version? So he wanted this abbreviated version that would contain everything, but to be used as a quick reference.
Krótko, jasnym, pięknym językiem.
briefly in clear and beautiful language, in a pleasant way to the ear, so that the Torah of Adonai will be accessible to every Jew. That's why he wanted to do it, for it to be accessible to every Jew.
że był dobrym pedagogiem, tak? Postanowił, że nie każdy uczeń może
Because
posłuchać
he
ciężkiego,
was a
ale
good
każdy
pedagogue,
musi się
he
uczyć.
decided that while not everyone can read very complex, difficult texts, nonetheless everyone should study. So he decided to make it so that everyone can study every day. So he divided it into sections,
Zrobił skrót do swojego
and
dzieła.
so he made an abbreviated version of his work Beit Yosef, and that's how Shulchan Aruch was created. And how did he divide this work?
Ponieważ dzieli jego dokładnie tak samo,
So it turns out that he divided it exactly the same way as the previous work we discussed. So Arbaturim of Rabbi Yaakov, he invented all of this. He didn't use 14 like Maimonides. He just had four chapters about life at the time. So Joseph Caro in the 16th century writes a commentary, Beit Yosef, and then he has an abbreviated version of the commentary, so it's even more brief than in Maimonides, but he divides his work in the same way.
też muszę powiedzieć, że kiedy mówię to, że uczący się znajdzie w nim wszelkiego rodzaju
So he says that the student, the learner, will find in it all kinds of ta'amim, literally flavors, the reasoning, motives, meanings, everything. He does not say that Shulchan Aruch must become the most important work. Everyone knows about Joseph Caro because he's the author of Shulchan Aruch, but actually the work Beit Yosef was his most important work, in his opinion. He wrote this abbreviated version, but actually he wanted for his main work, Beit Yosef, to become the most important. So just like Yaakov ben Asher had his work, Arba Turim, he wanted to include his sources to provide various versions, not to abbreviate it, but they understood that people need abbreviated versions. So Shulchan Aruch was written as an abbreviation to a code of law, not as a code in and of itself. And how about the name Shulchan Aruch? So this stems from the Midrash Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael from the 3rd century. And here there is a description. Why did he choose such a title? So in the Midrash, there is a description. Shulchan Aruch is a set table. So why such a name? Because in the Midrash, it is said that the Almighty instructed Moses to convey the laws of the Torah to the people of Israel in the most understandable and accessible form. And the Almighty says to Moses, Arham, so do it, order it in such a way, Lifnaheim keshulchan haruch, like a set table, that everything is ready. Present them before them like a set table. So it's based on this midrash of Mechilta that Rabbi Yosef Karo derives his inspiration to choose such a title. It's wonderful to know what inspired them, why they chose something like that. But we have another person. So when we talked about Joseph Caro, so we said he was from Spain. So what kind of rabbi was he? Ashkenazi or Sephardi one? Sephardi one. So this means that the tradition that he described in his works, in Shulchan Aruch, in Beit Yosef, the proper commentary, and the Arba Turim, this all stemmed from Spain. So it was the Sephardi tradition. And then we move to our lands. So now we are in the 16th century, not so it's almost the same time as Joseph Caro. So another important name, Rabbi Moshe Serles, who won one of the most prominent halachic authorities. He was a judge, a Kabbalist, a philosopher, but he's most well known for his work Mappa tablecloth. Do we know where he lived? You can see it in the picture. From the Kazimierz district in Krakow. So he was born and he died in Krakow. So he was born in the Kazimierz district to the family of Rabbi Israeli Serles, a wealthy man, one of the leaders of the Jewish community. So Rabbi Moshe Serles was a very modest man. He was also called Rema. It's an abbreviation from Rabbi Moshe Serles. So, on the one hand, in 1552, Rema established a large yeshiva in Krakow. So he was the head of the yeshiva for 20 years. He also established found a foundation that was heading the rabbinical court in Krakow. So he was a prominent person. But what happened? So Rabbi Moshe Isserles, and he died young. Some say he was 30-something years old. We don't know exactly. So on the one hand, he was a very influential person. He was so influential that on his tombstone, we have the inscription from Moshe to Moshe. There was no one like Moshe in Israel. So we have Moshe Rabbeinu and Moshe Isserles. But his works are kind of like an anecdote. So he wanted to write his halachic work. So at first he started to write a commentary to the book of Yaakov ben Asher, to Arba Turim. But we already know that in the same time, Yosef Karo already wrote such a commentary, and he called it Beit Yosef. So when Moshe started to write his commentary, he called it Darkei Moshe. So he wanted to express his innovative ideas, his halachic responsa, and he wanted to convey the Ashkenazi European tradition. But when, as he was working on it, he found out that Joseph Caro already wrote something similar, then he said, okay, then maybe I will abbreviate my Darkei Moshe, so the ways of Moshe. So maybe I will write my own concise book that will explain the book Beit Yosef. But then Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote his own abbreviated work, Shulchan Aruch. And then just imagine. So this poor Moshe Serles, who at first started to work on his commentary, and suddenly Yosef Karo already published his own. And then Serles starts to work on his abbreviation of Beit Yosef and Arba Turim, and then he hears that, well, okay, Yosef Karo already wrote such an abbreviation, Shulchan Aruch. So, what was he supposed to do? He was so modest that he wouldn't write something similar. He wouldn't say, okay, let's have a competition. Maybe my work will be better than yours. No, he decided that he will write his own work. And this work will be unique because it will be a supplement. It won't be something new, a supplement of something already existing. So when Shulchan Aruch already became very popular, Moshe Serles in 1569 publishes his notes, his commentary to the work of Yosef Karo, and he calls them mapa, tablecloth. So this is beautiful. So he said that my work, my code, will be a commentary to Shulchan Aruch, the set table. That's what Yosef Karo wrote, and Moshe Serles said, okay, if you have a set table, we need a tablecloth. So what is it? What is this mapa? Sometimes you have Sephardi traditions that differ from Ashkenazi ones, and then Moshe Serles says, well, yes, when it comes to this law, that's what they do, but here on our Polish lands, it's actually different, because here on our lands, we have our tradition, the minhag, which says that we do it in a different way. So in 1569, so towards the end of the 16th century, these two works were always published together. So Shulchan Aruch, which describes a certain law, and then in smaller print, it says, okay, and Rabbi Moshe Serles says that in the Ashkenazi tradition, it's actually in such and such a way. It's not that the whole Ashkenazi tradition agreed with him. Some said, no, what is he talking about? Traditions, minhag, traditions which are not halacha. And this is just Polish tradition, not from the whole Ashkenaz. Some would say like something like that. But generally, this tradition became very popular, well known, and that's how we have one unified collection of halakhic laws for all of Israel, which combines Sephardi tradition and the Ashkenazi tradition. So now we have become familiarized with all of these figures. So Rabbi Asher, who prepared the first commentary to the Talmud, his son Yaakov, who wrote the Arba Turim and was a very prominent and respected rabbi in his times. We know the next one, Yosef Karo, who wrote his commentary to Arba Turim, but he also abbreviated his commentary, and hence we have Shulchan Aruch. And now we know Moshe Serles, who said, okay, I won't be a rebel. I won't be arguing with Yosef Karo. I won't write another Shulchan Aruch, but I will write my commentary as supplement so that the Ashkenazi tradition can also have its expression. So these are our codes of Jewish law, and these are our different eras, different periods of Rishonim, the early ones, and we started the Aharonim, so the last ones. So that's what I wanted to tell you about today. And now, if you have any questions, it's a fascinating topic.